In the 13th lecture or talk on French astrology, I propose to English speakers, I would like to speak about French research in several directions. One of the most typical form of research is probably the work on the 12 signs connected with the planets. When I started astrology in the 60s, there was a great deal of research of that sort of problematic. And I dedicated actually one of my first books to this question in 1976. I was convinced that, at that time, I was convinced that there should be 12 planets because there were 12 signs. And this idea was shared by people like Jacques, probably before Carteret by a Roman in the 30s already. And later on by Lisa Morpurgo, the Italian astrologer, whom I met in 1971, at a time when my work on these rulerships was already developed. Not exactly in the way that Lisa Morpurgo had done it, but with certain similarities, especially the sort of ADN, helix. And the idea was that in fact there was 3 different stages in the system of rulerships, at least. Probably more than that, actually. The first system was a double system, rulerships and exaltations. 7 planets in each case. And I think they were distributed 2 by 2. And there were no planet ruling the mutable signs, because 8 signs were enough to handle the question of the 7 planets. Afterwards, when you can see what is written in Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, they abandoned exaltations, which was regrettable, because exaltations were based on the axis of the equinoxes and houses, I don't know, call that, thrones or whatever. I mean, the other system, the rulers, were organized around the solstices. I already developed that in the previous lecture, I think. I will not insist here about it. Point is that afterwards, in Tetrabiblos, they prefer to focus only on the rulers, what we call in French the domicile. And in Ptolemy's work, you see that there is an attempt to double the domicile, double the houses. Sign, which makes Saturn with 2 signs, and Jupiter with 2 signs, and Mars with 2 signs, etc., and so on. This system was supposed to replace the system of rulers and exaltations. And then, in the 19th century, still another system appeared, which meant to eliminate the double rulers, because there were new planets discovered since 1781 with Uranus, and in 1846 Neptune. So the idea was to abandon the two signs for one planet, and to consider that there would be eventually 12 planets to be discovered, and that each planet will rule one sign. That was what happened with Uranus, who took Aquarius from the 2 signs of Saturn, who only kept, in a sort of way, Capricorn. Neptune took one of the 2 signs of Jupiter. He took Pisces, and he left Sagittarius to Jupiter. Mars took Scorpio for Mars. Pluto took Scorpio for Mars, and Mars remained in Aries. Afterwards, there was no big progress, but some French astrologers, maybe also in Germany, I don't know exactly, with what they call the planet X and Y. And already Léon Lasson in the 30s, or in the 40s, they said, well, 2 planets are missing, one at the level of the 2 signs of Venus, and one at the level of the 2 signs of Mercury. And by the way, they returned to the idea that exaltation should be reactivated, so they attributed Uranus to Scorpio, because Saturn was attributed to Libra. And, well, I don't want to develop that, but some proposed, for instance, Neptune to Leo. We're not going to spend time about why that. And for Pluto, strangely enough, nobody has proposed something which was definitely accepted. So the exaltation of Pluto remains totally undetermined, etc., etc. In my work of 1976, Keys for Astrology, which was not translated in English but in Spanish, in 1979, I attributed, of course, an exaltation to Pluto and exaltation to the 2 trans-Plutonians, and it was redeveloped in a book which I published in 1983, which was not translated, called Mathématiques Divinatoires, which is divinatory mathematics. So, the double sign system was finally abandoned, and we returned to the idea of a double system with exaltations and domiciles, houses. So many researchers in astrology continued in this direction, and they used, in many cases, even Barbeau mentioned in his textbook on astrology, which was published in the 60s, he mentions the two planets to be discovered after Pluto, and they were called Proserpine and Vulcane, according to the work of Jacques. And I use also this vocabulary of Proserpine and Vulcan. As a matter of fact, Vulcan, it was rather paradoxical, because Vulcan was initially the name of a planet supposed to exist between Mercury and the Sun, and that's why it was called Vulcan, because it was very hot, supposedly very hot. And it was later on attributed to the furthest planet of the whole solar system, after Pluto, etc., etc. So not very hot, but still Vulcan, the name of Vulcan, subsisted. And as Proserpine, it was the house of the wife of Pluto, so it was normal that after Pluto there would be a planet called Proserpine. So, we can mention also the work of Roger Benoit Jourdain, who was also fascinated by the idea of the 12th planet. That's a type of research, of structural research. As a matter of fact, at this time, I was fascinated by all those systems of connection between planet and sign, which, when they were corrected, improved, amended, were rather impressive. The problem is, I was convinced already at this time that the exaltation, for instance, had been corrupted and that it had to be reconstituted. It was also the position of Isamar Fulgo, by the way. So we try to find criteria to rebuild the proper exaltations, except for Saturn in Libra, which seemed to be quite acceptable as the extreme to the light sun and moon in Aries and Taurus. The rest was something very doubtful. And I was convinced that that was the proof of a sort of transcendentalism, that mankind could not have created this system. I cannot remember exactly in what mood I was in the 60s. You know? But that was more or less my conviction, that this beautiful systems that I rebuilt were very important, and they were the key for astrology, actually. And later on, I changed my mind, and I discovered quite a new approach of the problem. That is, that finally those attributions, and that was confirmed by the work of Manilius in the Astronomical, those attributions of planets to signs were not at all supposed to work with real planets. On the contrary, they were supposed to replace the real planets. That is, when one planet was entering into one sign, it was as it were conjunct with the ruler of the sign, which of course were totally artificial and virtual. So it was not a system to be used in connection with real planets. It was a system for an astrology which did not know the real planet's position, on the contrary, and which invented some sort of correlation. And that was indication that there was a specific factor which would circulate from one sign to another, which would be in connection with each time, each sign would connect with a planet, in fact with a god, with a planet which was not really a planet. In that sense, astrology was taken from astronomy, the names of the planets, but not the planets themselves. Well, I won't want to develop that too much now. It's more complex than that. So, I believe that there was a factor, a vector, a point, which was moving from one sign to another, and which were becoming successively, it was becoming Aries when it was crossing, it was becoming Mars when it was crossing Aries, it was becoming Venus when it was crossing Taurus, etc., etc. But the problem is that astrologers did not believe in that way. They really used all the planets with this system of the rulerships. What I think this system of rulership was precisely conceived for an astrology without planets. And only one factor would be used. One which could be of astronomical essence, could be the moon, it could be the sun, it could be another planet, it could be maybe the rising sign, I don't know what, or even the midheaven, which would cross the 12 signs, and with each sign they were connected with a certain tonality, with a certain atmosphere, connected with a certain planet. And that is the problem, that is the dilemma of French astrology. That is, and today it's more obvious than ever, especially with the Rudyard's work, that finally astrology would need to use this sort of composition, this sort of structure, which was not astronomical. And by not being astronomical, could be useful. Because if you want to create a cycle, you have to get equal divisions. You cannot rely on the fact that each planet circulates in its own way, and it creates something a very great disorder, a great sort of chaos. And today, and I interviewed recently a few days ago an astrologer and confirmed that, today they like system where you have one factor which moves regularly at a regular pace, and this is not at all what would exist if you had all the planets to be concerned and considered. The Indian astrologers do the same, although the dasas they use are not equal, but at least they are not astronomical either, and they are fixed. The time duration of each phase never changes. So you see, the relationship of astrologers towards astronomy is quite ambivalent, quite ambiguous in many ways. I already mentioned the case of the zodiac. Astrologers in many ways do not sympathize with the zodiac. They're replaced by the four elements, they're replaced by the planets, they're replaced by the aspects. The aspects is also a way to structure the process of a planet without considering the zodiac. That's what Barbeau and afterwards Bernard have made. consider that what is important is not the sign of zodiac, but if it is a sextile or a trine or a square, etc. So, when you look more deeply, you see that astrologers have no sympathy for planets, no sympathy for real planets, no sympathy for signs. And sign symbolism is replaced by elements, rulerships, aspects. And for the planets, they use the names of the planets, and do not necessarily, like in India, relate to the real position of the planet. That's an aspect I wanted to treat. Another aspect is precisely the attempt by Jean-Pierre Nicolas, who is one of the greatest minds in astrology, in French astrology, of the second part of the 20th century. He decided, but in his own way, to abandon the symbolism of the zodiacal signs and the symbolism of the planets, and to replace it by other criteria. So he would have the 12 signs, but not according to their symbolism. He would have the 10 planets, but not according to their mythological names. He called that, for the group of planets, he divided the planet into 3 groups: Sun, Mercury, Venus. He called it R, like representation. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the middle of the system. He called it E, like existence. And the 3 trans-Saturnians, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, he called that T, like for transcendence. So, in fact, he defended the idea. He abandoned totally the rulerships, as a matter of fact. So he didn't want to hear of any trick which would put astrologers in divorce with the astronomy. On the contrary. So he reinstituted astronomy in the middle of astrology, but at the price of abandoning the symbolism of the planets and the names. No, he kept the name of the planet, but he didn't refer for their definition to the names of the gods. And although he also kept the names of the signs, he produced a definition. We call that the photoperiodical zodiac, which was not at all referring to the symbolism. In both cases, his argument was very simple. The planet is defined by its distance to the source, to the sun. And a sign is defined by the seasons which it is within. So that was his way of working. Finally, we are today in France with a system which is a little awkward, as I said, but not necessarily only exclusively in France. But, well, I'm speaking about French astrology here. So, it's like a building which has not been developed to the end, which has been stopped. They have introduced Uranus, introduced Neptune, introduced Pluto, and for Mercury and Venus, they still have, until today, 2 signs, while while the other planets have only one sign. Although they do not never forget that in fact Jupiter is also remains more or less the master of Pisces, and that Saturn also remains the master of Jupiter remains and that Saturn remains the master of Aquarius, etc. You know, so it is a rather tricky situation, which can only be understood by the fact that astrologers like to have a lot of combinations possible. They want to be able, if this doesn't work to explain something, I will use something else to explain it. So they like to have 4 or 5 possibilities to make the work. If it's not the signs, they are the planets. If it's not the signs, it's the aspects. If it's not rulers, that will be the angles. Whatever, what is important is that they should find some way to make a correlation between the chart and the person and the event. That is their main thing. So in fact, even if astrologers do not recognize that, in fact, they like to have a great deal of possibilities. Houses, signs, planets, aspects, rulers. And someone who is a good astrologer has to know what is the right way to make his demonstration. The astrological demonstration that astrology explains what it has to explain. Thank you.